I forgot that last service because at 8 a.m. I do the welcome too, so I've already said good morning. But at 9:30 and 11 we get help, so I have to remember good morning. So it's good to be with you. It's good on weeks that I preach because I don't usually stay all the way through the 11 o'clock service, and I feel like staying all the way through I get to see more people and talk to more folks. So it's a good morning. It's a good morning. We're continuing this week in the story of the Corinthian church, and in particular we've been looking at the story of the Corinthian church through the book of 1 Corinthians. I guess at some point we'll probably get to the second book, but right now we're just in 1 Corinthians. And I read this chapter 4, probably 7 or 8 times this week. And I could probably still read it again, go study it in the office, and get something different out of it. Paul says a lot of different stuff here. And it seems like in a first reading, every paragraph is about something different. So I had to come back again and again to say, okay, let me remind myself what Paul is talking about overall in the book of 1 Corinthians and what he's actually trying to address in the Corinthian church. So a refresher for us as we get started. Over the last couple weeks, we've looked at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, and we've found that Paul is addressing divisions in the church. Now, I think this came out earlier, but if it didn't, it comes out in this chapter. Those divisions arise from the sin of pride in the people. So Paul is addressing divisions in the church, which he says are rooted in pride. And we're going to find later this morning that at the root of pride is insecurity. So that's complicated, but there's a chain here. And it has to do with what I kind of see as an archetype of sin, the way that sin works, the way that sin brings death, is we are broken people in a broken world. Living in a broken world, we have wounds and brokenness within us. And in this case, that's insecurity. Now, in order to cover up for that insecurity, we become prideful, and we build ourselves up and tear others down. And what we see in the Corinthian church is that pride leads to divisions in the church. So Paul is addressing divisions in the church. He says that those are because of the sinful pride of the people. What we're going to find is that pride is really rooted in insecurity. That's the issue of brokenness. Okay? So that's to give you kind of a broad picture of where we're going. And as I saw that, a couple of questions came up for me. So, like, how does pride cause division in the church? And how and why is pride the result of insecurity? So we'll start there. And I want to start with to talk about how divisions in the church and pride are connected. I want to talk about a story from the modern American church. This is a true story. A couple years ago, there was a guy who wrote a book. He's a pastor at a large church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His name is Rob Bell. Has anybody ever heard of Rob Bell? Okay, more than 930, so. But still fewer than I expected. So Rob Bell wrote a book, and this is not his first book. In fact, it was his 4th book. And his first 3 books were bestsellers. People thought he was a good guy, great author, great pastor. But he was writing this 4th book. It was going to be called Love Wins. And even before the book was released, since it's at this point 2010, 2011, he released a promo video. And in this video, he was saying things like, if we serve a good God, why do people suffer? And he was asking questions like, is it really true that some people go to hell, or does everybody really go to heaven? And he was asking questions like that. And at the end of the video, he said, what we find is that in the end, love wins. That was what he said at the end of the video. And before the book ever came out, folks were upset about this. They were saying, I see where he's going. He's going to say that people don't go to hell. He's going to say everybody goes to heaven. This is a problem. Sure enough, the book comes out, and he didn't exactly say those things, but he asked a lot of provocative questions. So the author, Rob Bell, he was asking questions like, how do we really interpret the words of Jesus, and is there any other way to interpret them than to say that a broad spectrum of our population is condemned to hell? He said, is there some other way to interpret the words of Jesus to see that maybe we could be saved after we die? And he's asking questions like this, provocative questions. And there were some people who read the book and said, Rob Bell is saying that we can get saved after we die. And Rob Bell is saying not everybody goes to hell. Or that everybody could go to heaven. And then there were other authors then who wrote books in response and said, he's a heretic and he's wrong and I'm right. And there were people like you and me even who were writing blogs online and saying, Rob Bell's a heretic, kick him out. And then there was another author who wrote a book in response. His name is Francis Chan. He's a pastor out in California. And he wrote a book in response to this book called Love Wins. His book was called Erasing Hell. And he also released a promo video before the book came out. And in the video he said, I read this book, Love Wins, and I'm troubled. And he said, we'd like to really say that God is nice and everybody could go to heaven. He said, but it's just not true. He said, so I'm going to write a book in response. And he wrote this book, Erasing Hell. And he made his case, and he said, what Rob Bell said is wrong, and what I'm saying is right. And what started to happen was in the American church, people started choosing sides. And I was one of them. I read both of these books. And what I found, if people would ask me about it, I'd say, I read Love Wins, and Rob Bell asked some really good questions. And what I like about it is that he goes back to the words of Jesus, and he asks questions about that. I said, but my problem with Francis Chan is he just draws on church history and traditional interpretation and just says this is the way it's been interpreted, so now we have to interpret it that way. And then I tacked on, and I think Francis Chan was being vindictive. And all of a sudden, this body of people called the American church, these Christians who find the nexus of their spiritual life in grace, are passing judgment on two people they've never met. And we're choosing sides, and we're drawing lines, and we're saying, well, I can't really talk to you or worship with you because you like that book better and I like this book better. And the issue is that modern America finds their security in knowledge. So remember I said that in the case of the Corinthian church, we can trace these divisions in the church back to pride, and we can trace that pride back to insecurity. Well, in America, we find our security in knowing the right answers, being well studied, being able to tell you how it is. And so people in the Christian church say, man, I'm not really sure about my faith, or, I don't really know if I have solid ground to stand on in terms of what I believe. Well, let me learn more, and let me convince you that I know more than you do. And in fact, I'm even going to try to convince you that I know more than Rob Bell does, or I know more than Francis Chan does. And then I'll be sure that I have a place to stand on. I'll be secure because I know and I've proven to you that I know. And so we build ourselves up and we tear others down and we get really proud of ourselves because then we can feel secure. Then we can feel secure. The problem is that false security, that pride that builds yourself up and tears others down, it leads to death. It divides people. That's not the life that Christ promised us. And so we see the same thing happening in the Corinthian church. We see the same thing happening. We've covered the last couple of weeks that there was this controversy between the Apostle Paul, who had preached to the people in Corinth and started the church. And then there was another teacher who came along named Apollos, and he taught them some new things. And he was a better speaker and sounded more educated than Paul. And a division arose in the church, and people were saying, well, I follow Apollos, well, I follow Paul. And we can intimate from the passage that they're even saying, and what Paul says is hooey, and what Apollos says is better. Or what Paul says is better, and what Apollos says is hooey. Hooey is a theological term. At least it carries better than some other words I could have used. So there was, the people in Corinth were trying to build themselves up and put others down so that they could feel secure in their knowledge about their faith. But in so doing, they were dividing the church. We see Paul address it in verses 6 and 7, and I'll read them again here. Again, it's out of the Message, so it's not in the Bibles in front of you. He says, all I'm doing right now, friends, is showing how these things pertain to Apollos and me, so that you will learn restraint and not rush into making judgments without knowing all the facts. It's important to look at things from God's point of view. I would rather not see you inflating or deflating reputations based on mere hearsay. For who do you know that really knows you, knows your heart? And even if they did, is there anything they would discover in you that you could take credit for? Isn't everything you have and everything you are sheer gifts from God? So what's the point of all this comparing and competing? So there Paul first says, hey, don't talk bad about other people. Don't put people down. And in fact, he says, until you have the eyes of God, until you can see from God's point of view, you don't even really know people. You can't really say anything about them. And earlier in the passage, he says, we won't have God's point of view until the end of time. So he says, don't talk about people the way you're talking about them. Don't make judgments on them based on hearsay, gossip. And then the second thing is, he says is, why are you comparing and competing anyways when all that we are and all that we have is from God? Why are you trying to pass judgments on people? Why are you trying to call one better than the other when all we have is from God? Why are you trying to build yourself up and talk about how great you are when anything good in you is from God? There's nothing you can take pride in. This is what he says. And so we see that Paul is addressing that issue, that we have new Christians in Corinth who at some point were relying on the grace of God. That's how they came to faith. And they said, I have nothing, I am nothing, I have no solid ground to stand on, save for Christ. And somewhere along the way, they thought they could be better. And they had a problem kind of like we do. They had new money, and new money brings things like status and the in crowd. And so they said, I'm going to make sure I'm in the in crowd. I'm going to make sure I'm aligning with the right teacher. Because I'm not so sure anymore about the ground I'm standing on, so I'm going to build some ground for me to stand on, and I'm going to puff myself up. And in order to do it, I'm going to have to tear some people down. And that led to death, which is divisions in the church. So we're seeing that the Corinthian church is not much unlike the American church. So we've established that these divisions in the church in Corinth, and in fact sometimes in the American church, can be caused by people who are prideful, who build themselves up and tear others down because they're looking for security. They're looking for security. For the Corinthians, it was looking for security in who they followed. For us, in America, I think it's looking for security in what we know. And the issue is, the reason we need to find something to be secure in is because we are insecure. We have questions about our security. We are insecure. And so the question is, how does the gospel speak to our insecurity? Because I see often I think we want the gospel to speak to our behavior and just tell us what not to do. But what the gospel does is it comes into our brokenness and heals us there so that the act won't take place. So how does the gospel speak to our insecurity? Paul addresses this in verses 9 to 13 there in chapter 4. I'll read it for you again. He says, it seems to me that God has put us who bear his message on stage in a theater in which no one wants to buy a ticket. We're something everyone stands around and stares at, like an accident in the street. We're the Messiah's misfits. You might be sure of yourselves, but we live in the midst of frailties and uncertainties. You might be well thought of by others, but we're mostly kicked around. Much of the time, we don't even have enough to eat. We wear patched and threadbare clothes. We get doors slammed in our faces, and we pick up odd jobs anywhere we can to eke out a living. When they call us names, we say, God bless you. When they spread rumors about us, we put in a good word for them. We're treated like garbage, potato peelings from the culture's kitchen, and it's not getting any better. So Paul speaks to these people who say, I need to build up some solid ground for me to stand on. I need to be proud about who I am, so I'm going to build myself up and tear others down. And he says, you realize that guys like me and Apollos, the people who go around preaching God's message, you realize we don't have status in this world, right? He says, you realize everywhere we go, they slam doors in our faces. And we have to pick up odd jobs just to make a living. We don't make enough money. And I think couched in that message is the gospel for the people who are insecure. Because what Paul is saying is, in the midst of that struggle, in the midst of me being lowly in this world, I find my security somewhere else. I look to Christ and His glory in my life. And it's there that I find firm ground to stand on. And in that example, there's a promise that you too, when you're insecure, when you're uncertain, when you're stuck in the mess, here comes Christ to lift you up. You don't need to go out and make a way for yourself. You don't need to build yourself up and tear others down. You don't need to be proud. Because in your insecurity, in your uncertainty, comes Christ, speaking life, lifting you up, securing your future. That's why Paul goes on to say, so just follow me, do as I do. He says, imitate me. Because he's saying, I'm living this life that says, I don't put my security in the opinion of men or the status of this world, but I put my security in Christ. And I think that's the kind of thing that today lets us read 2 books by 2 notable authors. And rather than have to choose sides and build ourselves up, I can say, I don't know which one is right. They disagree. They both appear to me to be men of God who want to see His gospel spread. And I can't tell you which one is right. But I can tell you that I was broken and I was beaten. And rather than try to choose some book to find my security in, I'm going to stand here and call upon the name of Christ. I don't have to tell you which is right. I don't have to give you an answer because I know the one who answers for me. And so I stand in my frailty. I stand in my uncertainty. And in the midst of it, Christ picks me up. Christ makes me known. Christ gives me life. That's the promise for you and for me today. That in the midst of uncertainty and in the midst of frailty, we find security in Christ. In His name, amen.